Understood. I'll now write section 1 of the story script, faceless style, without headings, no scene labeling, no repetitions, and keeping it direct with tension, quality, and flow. It will run at least 760 words. Clara had grown used to the silence in her marriage, the kind of silence that spread across the house and filled her nights with a hollow ache. Daniel was always gone, buried in late hours, his energy spent before he ever reached her. She no longer waited for him to touch her, no longer hoped he would notice when she slipped into bed in a silk nightgown that used to matter. The body beside her had become nothing more than a reminder of what wasn't there. That void, steady and cold, was the reason she'd started seeking comfort alone, in quiet corners of the night, behind locked doors, in a rhythm that was hers alone. On that particular night, Clara's loneliness had pressed so heavy against her chest that she couldn't hold it back. The house was quiet, Daniel nowhere near, and Ethan was supposed to be asleep. She slipped into her bedroom, closed the door with a gentle push, and let herself unravel. No words, no names, only breath and the sound of sheets shifting under her weight. She let her hands roam, desperate to feel alive again, every nerve stretched and searching. Her body reacted eagerly, as though it had been waiting for permission. She pressed deeper into the sensation, losing herself to the quiet waves she could control, to the heat that only reminded her how neglected she was. She didn't hear the door at first. It was the smallest creak, subtle enough to be lost in the shuffle of her breaths. But then a pause followed, an unnatural pause. She froze, heart crashing against her ribs, and turned her head. The doorway wasn't empty. Ethan stood there. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just locked in place as though the sight had rooted him. Clara's stomach dropped, panic flooding every inch of her, and she yanked the sheets against her body. Her first instinct was shame, pure and raw, the kind that made her throat close up. This was her stepson. This was a line that should have never even been imagined. She should scream, demand he leave, cover herself entirely and bury this moment so deep that neither of them would dare let it rise again. But she couldn't move. The heat that had been building inside her didn't die with the shock, it shifted. Embarrassment tangled with something more dangerous, something she didn't want to admit. His stillness wasn't the stillness of disgust. He wasn't rushing away. He wasn't apologizing. He was watching. That Clara's breath caught, unsteady, and her body betrayed her by reacting, tightening instead of retreating. She pulled the sheets tighter, but not enough to hide everything, not enough to erase what he had already seen. The air grew unbearably thick. She didn't dare speak, and neither did he. Their silence carried more than words ever could, a silence that screamed with things unsaid. The seconds stretched endlessly, and every one of them carved deeper into her, etching the moment into something she knew she'd never forget. Finally, Ethan shifted. His hand moved against the doorframe, uncertain, his jaw tense, but his eyes didn't pull away. Clara's chest rose and fell rapidly, her throat dry as she tried to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't a child. He was a man, younger than her, yes, but his presence carried weight. She'd seen him in the house for months, quiet, respectful, always giving space. But now that space had vanished, replaced with something electric that burned between them. She wanted him gone, desperately, but another part of her, the one that had been starved for so long, felt something else entirely. She couldn't deny the pulse in her body, the lingering echo of her pleasure that refused to fade even as shame tried to smother it. She hated herself for the thought, but she also couldn't stop it. The thrill of being seen, the forbidden nature of it, clawed at her insides until she felt dizzy. Ethan finally stepped back. It was slow, deliberate, his gaze still holding hers as if reluctant to let go. Clara swallowed hard, pressing her lips together, unable to summon words. She watched him retreat, the door easing shut, leaving her alone again. Alone, but not the same. Her chest heaved, her fingers still tangled in the sheets, her body trembling from more than just what she had been doing moments before. When the silence returned fully, it was no longer the silence she had known. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, charged, loaded with a truth that could never be undone. Clara sank against the pillows, her mind racing with what had just happened. Her body still hummed, furious at her for stopping, but her thoughts screamed louder. She had been caught by Ethan. Not only caught, but watched. And she had let him. She hadn't screamed, hadn't demanded he leave instantly. She had allowed the moment to linger, if only for a breath too long. That breath was enough to change everything. She knew it. He knew it. Even without words, the truth had been exchanged between them. There was no erasing the memory of how she had looked in that vulnerable, raw state, no taking back the way his eyes had held her. The lines that had once kept their relationship neat and safe had blurred in an instant. Clara curled into herself, clutching the sheets until her knuckles turned white. She hated the warmth spreading through her body, the way her skin still tingled. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. But it did. It meant everything. And though she wanted to pretend it would fade by morning, a deeper part of her already knew better. That moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but could already feel pulling her in. Word count 772 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to move straight into section 2? 760 words. Next, carrying the tension forward.
Understood. Here's section 1 of your script, written in a faceless, narration-driven style with minimum 760 words, keeping it tight, to the point, and emotionally layered without repeating or dragging. I was never meant to belong in their world. The Morgan house stood tall, polished, and distant, like something taken straight from a magazine cover. To me, it was only a workplace, a place where my hands scrubbed surfaces, folded clothes, and polished glass until I could see my reflection staring back. But behind the glass, behind the walls, there was a silence I couldn't ignore. I was Amelia Carter, the housekeeper. I entered each morning quietly, never overstaying, never asking questions. Yet, the more time I spent there, the harder it became to ignore the cracks hidden beneath all that perfection. From the outside, Daniel and Isabella Morgan looked untouchable. Wealthy, beautiful, admired by neighbors. People whispered about their perfect marriage, their glamorous life, the love they must have shared. Inside, I saw something different. Isabella was elegance personified. Her beauty was effortless, her presence commanding. She was the kind of woman people stopped to look at when she walked into a room, even if she said nothing. But beauty doesn't mean warmth. She was distant, her voice often clipped, her smile more rehearsed than real. She had a busy schedule, meetings, events, brunches with friends who looked just like her, perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect lives. When she was home, her attention seemed anywhere but on her husband. Daniel, however, was different. He was approachable, warm in a way that caught me off guard. He greeted me every morning, sometimes stopping to ask if I was doing okay, or if I needed help carrying something. Small gestures that I brushed off at first, thinking it was just kindness. But it was more than I was used to. He carried himself with confidence, but I could sense something beneath the surface, a restlessness. His eyes sometimes followed Isabella when she passed by, not with admiration but with a quiet longing, as though he was reaching for something he could no longer hold. When she dismissed him with a half-hearted smile or a distracted nod, I noticed. When he tried to share a story and she scrolled through her phone, I noticed. Silence became their language, and I was there to witness it. I told myself I shouldn't pay attention, that I was just the housekeeper. My job was to clean, not to understand. But it was impossible not to see it, impossible not to feel it in the air around me. Their marriage was like their home, beautiful, polished, but fragile beneath the shine. I began to feel uneasy in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't my place to think about them, but I couldn't stop. Every detail became clearer over time, the way Isabella rarely touched him, the way Daniel's shoulders dropped whenever she left the room, the long nights when the house echoed with absence rather than intimacy, and then, there was the way Daniel looked at me. At first, I ignored it. A glance too long, a smile that lingered. I brushed it off, convinced I was imagining things. But slowly, I realized it wasn't in my head. He noticed me. Not just as the housekeeper, but as someone who existed in his world when no one else seemed to. That terrified me. Because I knew better. I knew what lines shouldn't be crossed, what boundaries weren't meant to bend. And yet, the awareness was there, quietly growing, silently pulsing every time he stood too close or asked about my day. It wasn't flirtation, not openly. It was something subtler, something dangerous. I kept reminding myself of who I was in that house. I didn't belong in their world of tailored suits and evening dinners, of expensive wines and curated lives. I was an outsider who stepped into their perfect image just to clean up the mess they didn't want to acknowledge. But sometimes, the outsider sees more clearly than anyone else, and what I saw was loneliness, his, hers, and eventually mine. Loneliness that filled the rooms more than laughter ever did. I began to carry that weight home with me, thinking about it when I should have been thinking about anything else. Thinking about him. Thinking about the silence that wasn't mine to break. I told myself to stop, to focus on my work, to close my eyes to what was happening right in front of me. But when you're inside a house long enough, you start to feel its heartbeat. And in that house, the beat was irregular, heavy, and fragile. Every corner I polished, every room I entered, the truth became clearer. This wasn't the story people imagined from the outside. Behind those walls was a marriage built on appearances, not connection. And I was standing in the middle of it, quietly watching, quietly knowing that I didn't belong, and yet, part of me felt drawn in, as though their silence was calling me too. I told myself it was nothing. Just a job, just a house. But even then, deep down, I already knew something was shifting, and sooner or later, I would no longer just be the housekeeper. Word count 770 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to move on and write section 2 in the same style? Minimum 760 words. No repetition. More intense escalation. Understood. Here's section 2 of your script, written in the same faceless, narration-driven style, with minimum 760 words, keeping it focused, tight, and layered with emotion without any unnecessary repetition. Days in the Morgan house began to change, though nothing was spoken aloud. Isabella's schedule grew longer, her absences stretching into evenings and nights. Work trips, charity events, dinners she insisted Daniel wouldn't enjoy. The house felt emptier, and in that emptiness, silence had a way of bringing people closer. Daniel started lingering more when I worked. At first, it was harmless. He'd pour himself a drink and sit at the counter while I prepared dinner for Isabella. He'd ask about my day, about things that no employer had ever cared to know. I tried to keep my answers short, polite, but there was something in his voice, something searching, that made me hesitate to walk away. I told myself it was loneliness. A man left too often in a house that looked more like a museum than a home. And yet, when he spoke to me, it didn't feel like the distant voice of a husband passing time. It felt personal. He asked about my family, my childhood, the dreams I never admitted out loud. He listened, really listened, as if my words mattered. It unsettled me more than it should have. Because I wasn't used to being heard, not like that. And with every conversation, a line I had promised myself I would never cross started to blur. The first time he stood too close, it wasn't deliberate. Or maybe it was. I had been stacking dishes, and when I turned, he was there, his hand brushing mine as he reached to help. The touch was fleeting, but it stayed long after he left the room. I replayed it in my mind, asking myself why it mattered, why it felt like something more. It happened again and again, in different ways. A hand on my shoulder when I bent to pick something up. His fingers grazing mine when he passed me a glass. His voice lower, softer, when it was only the two of us. Each moment innocent on its own, but together they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. I fought against it. I told myself this wasn't my life, this wasn't my story to live. I was here to work, nothing more. But temptation doesn't arrive as a storm, it comes as a whisper, slow and steady, until you don't realize how far you've drifted. One night, Isabella was away again, another weekend conference, another excuse. The house was quiet, too quiet. I had stayed later than usual, finishing tasks I could have left for the morning. Maybe I didn't want to leave, maybe I didn't want to go back to my own silence. Daniel found me in the kitchen, and instead of just thanking me for staying late, he offered me a drink. I should have said no. Every part of me knew I should. But I said yes. The glass trembled in my hand though I tried to steady it. Conversation flowed easier than it should have. He told me about the early days of his marriage, how different things used to be, how time and distance had stolen something he couldn't quite name. His voice carried the weight of confession, not meant for me but given to me anyway. And I listened, though every word felt like a step toward something dangerous. When his hand touched mine again, this time he didn't pull away. Neither did I. The silence between us spoke louder than anything else. I felt guilt, sharp and undeniable, but tangled with it was a longing I had buried for too long. It wasn't just about him. It was about being seen, being wanted, being more than invisible. The moment unraveled quickly after that. A glance held too long became a touch became something neither of us stopped. I told myself it would only be that one time, that the line had been crossed and could be buried again. But the truth was, once it happened, there was no going back. The house that had once been only work became a place of secrets. Every room felt charged, every corner holding memories I shouldn't have carried. My guilt grew heavier, but so did the pull. I told myself I could end it, that I should end it, but the lies were easier than the truth. When Isabella returned, everything looked the same on the surface. She moved through the house with her usual elegance, unaware of the cracks widening beneath her feet. But Daniel's eyes told a different story when they met mine, and mine betrayed me when they lingered on him too long. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about how easily I had let go of the person I thought I was. I wasn't just the housekeeper anymore. I was a secret, a choice, a mistake waiting to be discovered, and yet, in the quiet of my thoughts, I couldn't deny it. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. That was TH.
Got it. Here's section 3, minimum 760 words, written in the same sharp narration style, keeping it faceless, emotional, and without repetition or unnecessary filler. Daniel's discovery came quietly, not through a dramatic confession but through a mistake Emily hadn't noticed. One evening, while searching for a photo on her phone, he stumbled upon a half-written draft message she had forgotten to delete. The words weren't explicit, but they were intimate enough to slice through him like glass. He said nothing at first, but the air in the house changed. Emily felt it in the way he looked at her, not with love or warmth, but with a piercing silence that said he knew. When he finally confronted her, it wasn't with shouting or accusations. His voice was low, shaking, asking only, "How long?" Emily broke instantly, tears rushing before words could form. She confessed without defense, admitting the night with Michael, admitting the emptiness that had led her there. She begged him to believe it hadn't been about love for someone else, but about feeling invisible in her own marriage. But every word seemed to wound him more, as though each syllable was another betrayal. The days that followed were unbearable. Daniel moved into the guest room, leaving their shared bed cold and empty. Meals were eaten in silence, footsteps heavy in the halls. Sophie, too young to understand, noticed the distance and asked why Daddy doesn't smile anymore. Emily's heart shattered at the innocence of the question. She wanted to shield her daughter from the wreckage, but the truth hung in every corner of the house. Michael reached out once, sending a message asking if she was okay. Emily stared at it for hours before deleting it without reply. Whatever comfort he had once provided now felt poisonous. She realized he was not the answer, never had been. He had only been a mirror reflecting the cracks already in her marriage. And those cracks now threatened to split her family apart completely. Daniel kept his distance, but his silence was more brutal than anger. Emily longed for him to scream, to cry, to give her something she could respond to. Instead, he retreated inward, leaving her to drown in guilt alone. At night, she would stand outside the guest room door, hand hovering over the knob, but never found the courage to enter. It was Daniel who eventually suggested therapy, though not with the intention of fixing what had broken. "I just need clarity," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried exhaustion, as though he was too tired to carry the weight anymore. Emily agreed instantly, willing to endure anything if it meant she had a chance, however small, to rebuild. In those sessions, truths surfaced that had been buried for years. Emily admitted how lonely she had been, how she had felt like a fixture in the home rather than a partner. Daniel admitted that he had equated working and providing with love, blind to the fact that she needed his presence more than his paycheck. It was raw, painful, and at times unbearable. Yet beneath the pain was the faint glimmer of understanding they hadn't shared in years. The counselor told them that betrayal, while devastating, often forces couples to confront what they've avoided. Emily clung to that thought, though she knew it didn't excuse her choices. She told Daniel more than once that she didn't expect forgiveness, that she would accept whatever decision he made. But Daniel didn't walk away. He stayed, quietly, cautiously, testing whether rebuilding was even possible. The process was slow, fragile. Small gestures became monumental. The first time Daniel laughed at something Emily said, she cried afterward in private. The first time he reached for her hand across the table, it felt like a lifeline. Nothing erased the betrayal, but the effort to move forward began weaving new threads between them. Fragile but real, Sophie became their anchor. Her joy, her need for both parents, reminded them of the stakes. Emily often watched her daughter sleeping, vowing never to let her choices endanger that innocent smile again. The weight of her actions remained, but it shifted into determination, not to forget what she had done, but to ensure it never repeated. Daniel's forgiveness did not arrive in a single moment. It came in fragments, in the way he chose to stay in conversations rather than walk away, in the way his anger softened into sadness, and sadness into cautious hope. Emily knew trust would take years to rebuild, if it ever fully returned, but even the attempt felt like a gift she didn't deserve. Looking back, Emily realized the affair had given her nothing but pain. Yet in the wreckage, it had forced a confrontation she and Daniel might never have had otherwise. It was the darkest wound of their marriage, but it also became the reason they chose to rebuild rather than wither in silence. Late one evening, months after the discovery, they sat together in the kitchen, the air less heavy than it had been in a long time. Daniel looked at her, tired but softer, and said, "If we're going to do this, it has to be different." No more silence. Emily nodded, tears brimming, understanding that survival required complete honesty. No matter how hard, she carried the shame of what she had done, but also the clarity it brought. For the first time in years, she spoke openly, telling Daniel her fears, her needs, her regrets without hiding. And for the first time in years, he listened, fully, without distraction. The road ahead remained uncertain, but as Sophie ran into their arms the next morning, laughing, they held onto her together, united by more than the betrayal, united by the decision not to let it define them entirely. Emily reflected quietly that the affair was never a blessing, never something she would justify, but in a twisted way, it had become the unlikely gift that forced them to fight for what mattered most. Sometimes the deepest wounds carry the sharpest lessons. And in their case, the very act that nearly destroyed their family became the reason they began to truly build one again. Word count 777. Do you want me to also create the final polished combined 2000 plus word story file with all 3 sections seamlessly merged for your faceless video narration? Understood. Since you asked for section 1 of the infidelity script, minimum 760 words, I'll craft it as a faceless, direct narrative, no scene labels, no headings, no fluff. It will move with clarity, focusing on betrayal, tension, temptation, and emotions. Here's section 1, almost equals 760 words. The silence in their home had become louder than any argument they had ever had. Small exchanges were reduced to reminders about bills, questions about dinner, or comments on errands. Affection, once effortless, now felt like an obligation neither of them cared enough to pretend about anymore. He noticed how she smiled more at her phone than she did at him. She noticed how he spent longer hours outside, inventing reasons to linger away from her company. Both of them sensed the distance, but neither addressed it, because naming it would make it real, and neither had the strength to confront the truth. Head-on.it began innocently, or at least that was the excuse she whispered to herself the first few times. A colleague at work, Daniel, seemed to notice her in ways her husband no longer did. His compliments were subtle, never over the line, but the way his eyes lingered, the way his attention felt heavy on her, made her pulse race in ways she hadn't felt in years. She told herself she enjoyed the validation, nothing more. A little spark in an otherwise dim routine, harmless, controlled, manageable. But sparks, left unchecked, always threatened to become fire. When he first touched her wrist, it wasn't deliberate. Papers exchanged, fingers brushing, the warmth of his skin against hers. It should have meant nothing, yet she carried the ghost of that contact all day. She replayed it during dinner, while nodding absently to her husband's half-hearted recount of his day, her mind elsewhere. She felt alive, and guilty, but the guilt only deepened the thrill. That's how it always begins, the intoxicating mix of wrongness and desire. Meanwhile, her husband wasn't innocent either. He had grown close to someone too, though in a different way. A woman from the gym, Elena, with whom he shared long conversations before and after workouts. She laughed at his jokes, asked him about his goals, challenged him in ways his wife no longer seemed interested in. He told himself it was just friendship, but the time he spent crafting responses to her texts, the small rush he felt when her name lit up his phone, betrayed something deeper. He hadn't crossed the line physically yet, but the emotional tether was undeniable. Their marriage, in truth, was surviving on shadows. 2 people under the same roof, hiding secrets in plain sight, both craving what they no longer gave each other. Nights spent scrolling, pretending to sleep, side by side yet worlds apart. Trust had become an unspoken casualty, and routine was the thin glue keeping the facade together. Neither wanted to be the first to admit that something was breaking, so both sought comfort elsewhere, quietly, carefully. For her, Daniel became the forbidden thought she carried into bed. She imagined what it would be like to let his hand stay on hers, to lean into the warmth instead of pulling back. She imagined his voice in her ear, the way he might touch her with the hunger she craved. Those thoughts made her heart race beneath the blankets, while her husband lay inches away, oblivious to the storm she was nurturing inside. She hated herself for wanting it, but the wanting only grew stronger with every encounter. For him, Elena became the mirror he needed. She made him feel younger, stronger, worth listening to. When she asked about his dreams, he realized he hadn't spoken about them in years. With his wife, conversations were practical, functional. With Elena, he felt seen. He found excuses to stay longer at the gym, even when his workouts were done, stretching the minutes into hours because those stolen fragments of connection felt more nourishing than anything waiting for him at home. Neither admitted it out loud, but both knew they were drifting closer to the edge. A point was coming where subtlety would no longer be enough, where unspoken thoughts would demand action. The tension in the air grew thick, unbreakable, and the guilt was no longer a deterrent. Guilt began to feel like part of the ritual, a companion to desire. They didn't stop because part of them no longer wanted to. The most dangerous part of betrayal isn't the moment it happens. It's the long silence before, the justifications, the half-truths you tell yourself to make the impossible seem harmless. She told herself she just needed to feel wanted again. He told himself he just needed someone to remind him he mattered. They convinced themselves it wasn't serious, not yet, nothing that couldn't be erased if they stopped now. But deep down, both of them already knew that lines, once blurred, are never fully redrawn. Their story hadn't reached its breaking point yet, but it was inevitable. Every choice they made in secret was a step toward that collision. A marriage cannot withstand two people living double lives. Trust doesn't survive in shadows. And though they didn't know when or how, they both sensed the reckoning was coming. One night, one truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. Word count 768. Do you want me to move forward and write section 2? Another 760 words, in the same style, picking up the escalation. Got it. Here's section 2 of the Faceless Infidelity script, written in the same tight, direct, no fluff style, with a minimum of 760 words. The shift happened slowly, disguised in the rhythm of ordinary days, until one decision tilted everything out of balance. She lingered longer in conversations with Daniel, their words slipping past work and into personal corners of their lives. What started as comments about long meetings or stressful deadlines turned into confessions about feeling unseen, unappreciated, forgotten. His responses weren't dramatic, but they carried the weight of someone who was actually listening. That kind of attention becomes addictive before you even realize it, and she was already hooked. Every smile he gave her felt like a secret gift, a reassurance she didn't know she had been starving for. Her husband, in turn, was deepening his own secret tether. Elena had become more than just a gym acquaintance. Their chat spilled outside of workouts, filling hours with small messages that made his days brighter. She asked questions his wife never thought to ask anymore, questions that made him reflect, laugh, and feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. When she teased him, when she complimented him, he caught himself replaying her words long after they had left his phone screen. His guilt wasn't strong enough to stop him, it merely sharpened the pleasure. He rationalized it by telling himself it wasn't physical. But desire rarely stays still, it grows, stretches, demands more. For her, the line blurred the day Daniel invited her out for coffee under the guise of a casual break. Sitting across from him outside the office, her pulse raced, not because of what they were doing, but because of what it meant. She laughed too much, leaned in too close, let his gaze linger without breaking it. Every second was a test of self-control she wasn't sure she wanted to pass. She told herself she was still in control, that she could walk away anytime. But the truth was, she had already chosen to stay. At home, the silences grew heavier. She caught her husband smiling at his phone once, and though he quickly hid it, the moment carved a hollow in her chest. She wanted to ask who it was, but didn't, because she knew her own secrets would collapse under the weight of such a question. That unspoken awareness built a fragile truce between them. Don't ask, don't confess, keep pretending. Both were guilty, both complicit, both playing a dangerous game in separate corners of the same house. He began skipping dinners more often, claiming late meetings or longer workouts. She began staying out later herself, blaming traffic or errands. They told themselves these lies were necessary, but the lies only widened the distance. The home became a place of cover stories, not comfort. What bound them together wasn't love anymore, but the routine of marriage, the inertia of shared years. Affection had turned into a shadow, intimacy replaced with secrecy. Her moments with Daniel intensified. The first time his hand stayed too long on hers, she didn't pull back. The electricity of that simple touch sent her spiraling, and though nothing more happened, she carried it like a confession she couldn't speak aloud. Her heart betrayed her every time he leaned close, every time his voice dipped into softness. She began choosing her outfits with him in mind, not her husband, not even herself. Desire reshaped her choices, disguised as ordinary decisions, until everything she did was anchored to him. For her husband, Elena had become more than company, she was temptation in plain sight. He noticed how she adjusted her hair, how she laughed when their eyes met, how she seemed to understand him with effortless ease. He didn't cross the line, but he wanted to. The thought of it played in his head at night, filling the silence where his wife's voice used to be. He fantasized about the what-ifs, the possibilities, the release from the weight of disappointment at home. His longing wasn't for love, but for escape. Both of them told themselves they were victims of neglect, starved of connection in a marriage that had withered. They didn't see that their hunger was driving the very decay they resented. Trust had already eroded, the foundation was fractured. The marriage wasn't destroyed in one moment, but in countless small choices, each one pushing them further apart. She knew she should stop. She knew the thrill of Daniel's attention was dangerous, that every smile, every lingering look was building toward a moment sh.